In 1949, a book appeared in France that the Vatican would soon place on its index of forbidden books. It was denounced as obscene, immoral, dangerous to the family, and corrosive to civilization itself. Its author was accused of corrupting women, attacking motherhood, and undermining the very structure of society. Newspapers mocked her. Politicians condemned her. Strangers sent hate mail. And yet the book did not disappear. It spread, quietly at first, then explosively, across Europe, across America, across generations. Its title was The Second Sex. Its author was Simone de Beauvoir. And with a single sentence, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. She ignited a revolution that would outlive her, outgrow her, and permanently alter the intellectual landscape of the modern world. But long before she became the woman blamed for dismantling tradition, Simone de Beauvoir was a devout Catholic child from a respectable Parisian family, determined to be virtuous, obedient, and invisible in the ways society required of young girls. What happened between that obedient girl and the woman whose ideas shook governments, churches, and marriages? What does it take to dismantle an entire system of thought? And what does it cost the person who dares to try? Simone de Beauvoir was born on January 9, 1908 in Paris, into a world defined by hierarchy, ritual, and expectation. The apartment on Boulevard Raspail reflected the quiet assurance of the French bourgeoisie. Polished furniture, measured conversation, a belief in propriety that felt less like choice than inheritance. Her father, Georges de Beauvoir, carried himself with theatrical elegance. He had trained as a lawyer, but his true passion was literature and the stage. He recited verses from Racine and Corneille with expressive delight, turning the family salon into a miniature theatre. He admired intelligence, wit, and style, and he recognized these qualities early in his eldest daughter. Yet George was also a man shaped by pride and disappointment. The First World War eroded much of the family's fortune, stripping away financial certainty and leaving behind a sharper awareness of social fragility. Her mother, Françoise Brasseur, embodied a different force entirely. Deeply Catholic, morally exacting, and unwavering in her sense of duty, she governed the domestic sphere with discipline. Prayer, modesty, obedience. These were not suggestions, but imperatives. If Georges represented imagination and cultivated irony, Françoise represented structure and salvation. Between them, Simone absorbed contradiction, the seduction of language and the authority of faith, theatrical freedom and moral surveillance. The tension did not fracture her childhood, but it sharpened it. From an early age, she understood that belief and performance could coexist, and that neither was entirely stable. Simone was a serious child, not solemn in the sense of gloom, but in intensity. She learned to read early and devoured books with a hunger that unsettled adults. Stories were not escape, they were expansion. Through them, she glimpsed worlds beyond the confines of bourgeois expectation. She competed fiercely at school, driven not by vanity but by a need to excel. Excellence, she sensed, was a form of autonomy. Her younger sister Hélène, known affectionately as Poupette, adored her. The sisters shared secrets, invented private games, and retreated together into imagination. Simone was protective and commanding. Poupette, gentler, followed her lead. Their bond softened the rigidity of the household, offering companionship in a world already structured by judgment. In early 20th century France, daughters of the bourgeoisie were raised with a clear trajectory. Education sufficient to attract a respectable husband, refinement without ambition, virtue without inquiry. Marriage was destiny. Independence was suspect. Simone absorbed these expectations even as she quietly rejected them. She sensed, with a clarity unusual for a child, that her desires did not align with the script prepared for her. She wanted not security but authorship. By the age of 10, she had decided she would be a writer. The declaration was not theatrical, it was methodical. Writing promised permanence, voice, and authority. All things denied to women confined to drawing rooms. The war's aftermath intensified this resolve. Georges de Beauvoir's financial losses altered the family's standing. The dowry that might have secured advantageous marriages for his daughters diminished. For Simone, this shift was revelation. If wealth could evaporate, then dependence on it was illusion. Education, not inheritance, would determine her future. Academic achievement ceased to be ornament. It became necessity. She studied with discipline that bordered on severity, rising early, memorizing passages, mastering arguments. The classroom was not merely a place of learning but a battleground where intellect replaced fortune. At the Institut Adeline Désir, and later the Cours Désir, Simone distinguished herself immediately. She approached philosophy, literature and mathematics with equal seriousness. Teachers noted her precision and intensity. Classmates sometimes found her intimidating. She did not flirt with mediocrity. Beneath her confidence lay vigilance, a determination never to be reduced to ornament or dependency. It was during these years that she formed a profound friendship with Elizabeth Lecointre, known as Zaza. Zaza was brilliant, lively, and bound by the same Catholic framework that structured Simone's upbringing. Their bond was electric and intimate, sustained by shared ambition and mutual recognition. In Zaza, Simone found a mirror, another young woman chafing against constraints. Yet Zaza's life unfolded under heavier parental control, particularly in matters of affection and marriage. Simone watched as her friend's desires were stifled by family authority, her independence curtailed by religious expectation. The conflict left marks. Without dramatizing her friend's suffering, Simone understood the cost of obedience. Zaza's later death, still ahead in their shared chronology, would strike Simone with devastating force, embedding within her an unshakable suspicion of institutions that sacrificed individual freedom to propriety. Even in adolescence, the seeds of this conviction were germinating. Around the age of 14, Simone confronted a crisis that would alter her interior landscape permanently. Her faith, once accepted as natural law, began to erode under scrutiny. She read widely, questioned doctrine, and examined belief not with adolescent rebellion but with analytic rigor. The existence of God, once assumed, no longer withstood her interrogation. When she declared herself an atheist, it was not shouted in defiance. It was a silent revolution. In abandoning God, she severed herself from the moral universe embodied by her mother. The break was quiet but immense. It introduced tension at home, a sense of estrangement that never fully healed. Yet it also granted her intellectual exhilaration. Without divine authority, responsibility shifted inward. Meaning would not be inherited, it would be constructed. This shift isolated her. She could not fully share her skepticism with Françoise, nor could she comfortably inhabit the pieties of her peers. But isolation strengthened her self-reliance. She began to conceive of existence as project, a life shaped by deliberate choice rather than obedience. Marriage, in this emerging framework, appeared not as destiny but as limitation. Financial dependence on a husband felt like surrender of agency. She resolved, with an almost ruthless clarity, that she would support herself through her mind. Thought would be her profession, writing her vocation. In 1926, Simone de Beauvoir entered the Sorbonne with a clarity of purpose that set her apart, even in a city alive with ambition. Paris, between the wars, pulsed with argument and reinvention. Cafes overflowed with political debate. Newspapers chronicled fragile governments rising and collapsing. The memory of trenches and shattered youth lingered beneath the surface of intellectual exuberance. The war had ended less than a decade earlier, but its shadow remained long and instructive. A generation had watched inherited certainties crumble. Simone absorbed this atmosphere not as spectacle but as challenge. Women were present at the university, but rarely in philosophy, and almost never with the intention of dominating it. Philosophy was still a masculine citadel, guarded by tradition and competitive ritual. Simone did not arrive to observe politely. She arrived to master. She studied with ferocious concentration, reading late into the night, dissecting arguments line by line, training her mind like an instrument. Her notebooks were meticulous, her questions exacting. She was not content to participate. She intended to excel. The ultimate measure of excellence in the French academic system was the agrégation, an examination so demanding that it functioned as both credential and gatekeeper. Passing it meant entry into the intellectual elite. Failing meant years lost to preparation. The exam required not only mastery of philosophical history, but originality under pressure. Candidates were ranked publicly. Reputation began there. Simone understood the stakes completely. The agrégation was not simply a test, it was a declaration of legitimacy. As she prepared, she encountered a young man whose reputation already preceded him. Jean-Paul Sartre was slightly older, brilliant, unconventional in manner and dress, his gaze restless and penetrating. He had attempted the agrégation once and failed. The setback had not diminished his confidence, but it had sharpened it. When they met through mutual academic circles, the encounter was immediate and electric. Not romantic in the conventional sense, but combative. They argued. They challenged each other's interpretations of Descartes and Kant, dissected Bergson and Hegel, probed the structure of consciousness. Each recognized in the other an intelligence unwilling to yield. Simone was not dazzled by Sartre. She assessed him. He, in turn, saw in her something rare, a mind as rigorous as his own, unafraid of confrontation. Their conversations unfolded across libraries and cafes, neither conceding ground easily. Attraction, when it emerged, was inseparable from thought. They did not fall into sentiment. They constructed alliance. In 1929, the decisive year arrived. Simone was 21. The agrégation loomed. She prepared obsessively, isolating herself from distraction, rehearsing arguments aloud, refining her prose until it cut cleanly. Sartre, having failed once, approached the exam with equal determination. When the results were announced, Sartre ranked first, Simone ranked second. Yet the numbers concealed something extraordinary. At 21, she was the youngest person ever to pass the agrégation in philosophy. In a field dominated by men who had spent years preparing, she had not merely succeeded, she had nearly triumphed outright. The ranking mattered less than what it signified. She was not entering intellectual life as adjunct or companion. She had proven herself publicly. From the beginning, she and Sartre stood as equals. The narrative that would later attempt to cast her in his shadow could not erase the historical fact of that moment. It was in the aftermath of this shared victory that they forged what would become one of the most debated personal arrangements of the 20th century. They called it a pact. They would remain essential to one another for life, bound by intellectual partnership and radical honesty. They would reject marriage, which Simone viewed as an institution designed to subordinate women economically and socially. They would refuse bourgeois conventions that equated respectability with possession. At the same time, they permitted contingent loves, relationships outside their bond, acknowledged openly rather than hidden. The arrangement was audacious, particularly in the context of 1930s France, where marriage remained social bedrock and female virtue tightly policed. Yet this was not rebellion for display. It was an experiment rooted in philosophy. If freedom was to be meaningful, it had to be practiced. If authenticity required truth, then concealment was betrayal. They sought to live their ideas rather than merely lecture about them. For Simone, the pact was also insurance. She would not become dependent, emotionally or financially, on a husband. She would sustain herself through work. Freedom, once declared, would need continual defense. The agreement with Sartre promised equality, but equality is not static. It must be negotiated repeatedly. Beneath the clarity of their principles lay human complexity. Jealousy, vulnerability, and asymmetry would inevitably surface. Yet at this stage, conviction outweighed caution. Her professional life began soon after. Appointed to teach philosophy in provincial lycées, first in Marseille, later in Rouen and other cities, Simone entered classrooms as one of the few young women qualified to teach at such level. She carried herself with authority. Students found her intense, demanding, magnetic. She encouraged debate, insisted on precision, and treated ideas as urgent rather than ornamental. For the first time, she earned her own income. Financial independence was not symbolic, it was concrete. Each paycheck affirmed her refusal of dependency. Yet independence did not eliminate ambiguity. In the charged environment of youth and mentorship, emotional entanglements emerged. Some of her relationships with female students blurred the line between intellectual guidance and personal involvement. These episodes, later scrutinized and controversial, unfolded within a culture where boundaries were less formally codified but no less consequential. They reflected the experimental ethos she shared with Sartre, a belief that experience should be lived intensely and honestly. They also revealed the risks embedded in such freedom, especially where power differentials existed. By the early 1930s, Simone de Beauvoir stood fully formed as an intellectual adult. She had secured the highest academic credential available, established financial autonomy, and bound herself to a partnership that rejected convention while demanding perpetual negotiation. She moved between classrooms and cafes, between provincial towns and Parisian debate, with growing confidence. Europe, meanwhile, shifted uneasily. Economic instability deepened. Extremist politics gathered force. The fragile optimism of the interwar years began to thin. In the early 1930s, Simone de Beauvoir moved between provincial classrooms and the restless intellectual life of Paris with deliberate rhythm. Assigned to teach philosophy in Marseille and later in Rouen, she carried herself with the authority of someone who had earned her place in a system not built for her. Her days were structured by lectures and examinations, but her evenings belonged to writing. Not yet the public figure she would become, she filled notebooks with diaries, drafted stories, tested philosophical ideas against lived experience. She refused to be merely Sartre's companion in thought. If they were equals, she would prove it on the page. Around them, a small constellation of young thinkers gathered. Ambitious, argumentative, hungry for new language. They debated in cafes thick with smoke and urgency, passing Husserl and Heidegger, dissecting consciousness and choice. Simone did not orbit these discussions, she sharpened them. Yet even within this circle she sensed the subtle gravity that pulled attention toward Sartre. He was brilliant, theatrical, quick to dominate a room. Simone's intelligence was cooler, more patient, less inclined toward spectacle. She was already searching for a voice that would not echo anyone else's. Europe, meanwhile, was shifting. Fascism consolidated power in Italy and Germany. Spain fractured into civil war. The French Third Republic trembled under political strain. The optimism of the post-war decade eroded into suspicion and polarization. Simone watched the news with analytic calm, but she understood that ideas no longer lived safely in books. They pressed against reality. When war was declared in September 1939, abstraction collapsed. Sartre was drafted into the French army and in 1940 captured by German forces. He was sent to a prisoner of war camp in Trier. Paris fell soon after. German troops marched beneath familiar facades. Swastikas replaced tricolour flags. the city adjusted to occupation with an unsettling mixture of defiance and accommodation. Cafes remained open, conversations lowered in volume. Food grew scarce. Censorship tightened. Survival required calculation. Simone remained in Paris. She continued teaching for a time, navigating restrictions with outward composure. Her letters to Sartre during his captivity reveal neither theatrical despair nor submissive longing. She missed him deeply, but she did not dissolve in his absence. She wrote steadily, reflected on her own solitude, and measured her freedom against the constraints imposed by war. The occupation stripped life to essentials. Choices that once seemed theoretical now carried consequence. Who collaborated? Who resisted? Who justified small compromises as necessity? In 1941, Sartre was released and returned to Paris. The reunion was intense, but not sentimental. Both had changed. The war had clarified something fundamental. Freedom was not a romantic abstraction, but a condition tested under pressure. They had lived months apart, each confronting vulnerability and isolation. Their conversations deepened, sharpened by experience. Existentialism, still unnamed as movement, crystallized in their exchanges. Freedom was inseparable from responsibility. Circumstances might constrain action, but they could not erase choice. To deny this was to live in bad faith. Simone's writing matured in this atmosphere. In 1943, she published her first major novel, She Came to Stay. On its surface, the book portrays a triangle between a couple and a younger woman. But beneath the narrative lies an examination of jealousy, possession, and the limits of radical honesty. The characters, thinly veiled versions of herself, Sartre, and Olga Kosakiewicz, enact the experiment she and Sartre had designed years earlier. What does it mean to claim freedom while binding oneself to another? Can transparency eliminate betrayal? Simone did not present answers. She exposed fractures. The novel announced that she was not merely interpreting existentialism. She was dramatizing its tensions. That same year, controversy shadowed her professional life. Accusations regarding her relationships with former students resurfaced, and her teaching post was revoked. The dismissal was quiet but decisive. Institutional respectability evaporated. For Simone, the loss was less humiliation than liberation. Teaching had provided income and structure. Writing offered sovereignty. Stripped of the lycée classroom, she committed herself fully to intellectual work. Occupied Paris grew harsher as the war dragged on. Arrests increased, deportations intensified. Whispers of resistance circulated through coded language. Simone observed with clinical attention the moral gradations around her. Few were purely heroic. Few purely complicit. Life under occupation demanded daily negotiation. It was here, amid ambiguity, that her understanding of freedom sharpened. To choose was unavoidable. Even silence signified alignment. In August 1944, Paris erupted. Allied forces entered the city. German troops retreated. Crowds filled the streets, jubilant and vengeful. The liberation was both catharsis and reckoning. Collaborators were denounced. Women accused of fraternizing with Germans had their heads shaved in public humiliation. Simone moved through this charged atmosphere with watchful restraint. The war's end did not erase complexity. It exposed it. Emerging from occupation, she and Sartre recognized that philosophy could no longer remain confined to lecture halls. In 1945, they founded Les Temps Modernes, a journal intended to engage literature, politics, and ethics as inseparable. It was an assertion that intellectual life carried public responsibility. France was redefining itself. Colonial tensions simmered. The Cold War's early outlines began to form. Through the journal, Simone stepped into a more visible role. She wrote essays that addressed not only metaphysics, but history. The private experiment in living had become public intervention. By 1945, Simone de Beauvoir was no longer simply a precocious scholar or an equal partner in a daring pact. She had endured war, occupation, and the moral ambiguities of survival. She had written fiction that exposed the emotional cost of freedom. She had lost institutional security and gained intellectual autonomy. Europe lay shattered, its certainties dismantled. In the rubble, Simone stood poised, sharpened by crisis. Her essays in the late 1940s reflect a widening horizon. She wrote about moral responsibility in a compromised world, about the ambiguities of freedom in societies rebuilding from ruin. Increasingly, she traveled. In 1947, she crossed the Atlantic to lecture in the United States, a journey that would deepen her political and social awareness in ways she had not anticipated. America dazzled and disturbed her. She observed abundance and optimism, but also excess, a consumer culture built on display and acquisition. Beneath the surface of prosperity, she saw rigid gender expectations and racial segregation enforced not by occupying armies, but by custom and law. In the American South, segregation revealed itself with stark clarity. Separate entrances, separate seating, separate lives. Simone recognized in this system an institutionalization of inequality that echoed other forms of oppression. She did not romanticize America's energy. She dissected its contradictions. During this period, she met Nelson Algren, a writer whose emotional directness contrasted with the cultivated intellectualism of Paris. Their relationship unfolded across letters and brief encounters, marked by affection, misunderstanding, and the difficulty of sustaining intimacy across continents. Algren represented a different register of connection, less abstract, more rooted in lived struggle. The affair did not replace her bond with Sartre, but it complicated her emotional landscape. It also sharpened her awareness that freedom in theory did not dissolve longing in practice. By the late 1940s, Simone's attention turned inward and outward simultaneously. She had achieved a degree of independence rare for a woman of her generation. She lived on her own terms, earned her income, wrote without apology. Yet she recognized that her life was not representative. Most women remained bound to domesticity, economic dependence, and social expectation. The contradiction unsettled her. If existentialism insisted that existence precedes essence, that individuals create themselves through choice, then why did women's choices appear so constrained? The question began quietly: what does it mean to be a woman? It was not a slogan, but an inquiry. Simone approached it with the same discipline that had carried her through the aggregation. She read voraciously: biology texts, psychoanalytic theory, historical records, myths, novels. She examined how femininity had been constructed across centuries, how philosophers, scientists, and poets had defined woman as deviation from a male norm. She traced marriage laws, economic structures, religious doctrines. Her method was neither polemic nor anecdotal. It was forensic. She dismantled assumptions layer by layer, revealing the scaffolding beneath cultural narratives. The work consumed her. Writing The Second Sex was not an act of provocation but of architecture. She intended to construct an argument so comprehensive that it could not be dismissed as sentiment. She refused to rely solely on personal grievance. Instead, she analyzed how society shaped women from childhood onward, through education, expectation, myth. She examined motherhood not as sacred inevitability but as institution. She scrutinized sexuality with unflinching precision. In doing so, she crossed boundaries rarely breached by women in public discourse. In 1949, the first volume of The Second Sex appeared, followed by the second shortly after. The reaction was immediate and volatile. Newspapers accused her of indecency. Clergy denounced her moral corruption. The Vatican placed the book on the Index of Forbidden Books, a formal condemnation that paradoxically amplified its reach. Critics attacked not only her ideas but her character, reducing her to caricature, immoral, unfeminine, dangerous. The outrage was not simply about content, it was about authorship. A woman had claimed authority over the analysis of womanhood. At the center of the book stood a sentence that would reverberate across decades. One is not born, but rather becomes, a woman. The statement cut through centuries of determinism. It reframed femininity as product of social construction rather than biological destiny. Simone did not deny biology, she contextualized it. She insisted that society transformed physical difference into hierarchy. The implication was explosive. If womanhood was constructed, it could be reconstructed. The backlash was intense. She received letters filled with accusation and admiration in equal measure. Some readers recognized in her pages their own unspoken experiences. Others felt personally indicted. Simone absorbed the scrutiny with outward composure. She did not retreat into apology, nor did she embrace martyrdom. She understood that intellectual intervention carried consequence. The book's success ensured that she would no longer be perceived merely as Sartre's companion or as a novelist among many. She had articulated a critique that destabilized cultural foundations. Privately, the attention altered her daily life. Strangers now approached her not to debate metaphysics, but to challenge her morality. Her name became shorthand in newspapers for scandalous thought. Yet she continued writing, traveling, engaging in debate. The controversy clarified her role. She had crossed from philosophy into movement, whether she intended to or not. By the end of 1949, France stood divided. To some, Simone de Beauvoir embodied intellectual decadence. To others, she represented awakening. The fault lines ran through households, universities, churches. The book's consequences extended beyond immediate reaction. It seeded questions that would unfold over decades. The decade unfolded against a backdrop of escalating geopolitical tension. The Cold War divided Europe into ideological camps, and France wrestled with the disintegration of its colonial empire. In 1954, the Algerian War began, fracturing French society with unprecedented intensity. Simone aligned herself openly with anti-colonial causes, supporting Algerian independence through essays and public statements. Her stance invited further criticism. To oppose colonial policy was, for many, to betray national identity. Yet she viewed the conflict through the same ethical lens she had applied to gender. Domination justified by tradition remained domination. She and Sartre increasingly engaged in political activism that blurred the boundary between philosophy and intervention. They signed petitions, published articles, and used les temps modernes as a platform to condemn torture and repression. Their positions provoked hostility not only from conservatives, but from moderates wary of destabilizing rhetoric. Simone did not position herself as revolutionary in the streets. Her weapon was language. But words, in that climate, carried consequence. Her partnership with Sartre endured, sustained by habit, affection, and intellectual symbiosis. The pact they had forged decades earlier remained intact in principle. Yet principles, lived over time, accumulate strain. Both maintained contingent relationships, some tender, some volatile. Jealousy flickered beneath assertions of freedom. Loyalty was tested not by betrayal in secrecy, but by the difficulty of balancing autonomy with attachment. Simone never relinquished her insistence on independence. She maintained her own apartment, her own finances, her own work. Still, emotional equilibrium required negotiation. The experiment in radical honesty revealed not only possibility but vulnerability. In 1954, she published The Mandarins, a novel that would win the Prix Goncourt and cement her reputation as a major literary force. The book traced the moral dilemmas of post-war intellectuals navigating political commitment and personal disillusionment. Its characters, thinly veiled reflections of real figures within her circle, wrestled with compromise and responsibility in a fractured world. Simone did not disguise the cost of engagement. Through fiction, she exposed the tension between ideals and action, between private desire and public stance. The prize brought recognition beyond controversy. She was no longer known solely for her feminist critique. She was acknowledged as a novelist of formidable scope. Travel broadened her perspective further. She journeyed to China in the mid-1950s, observing a society undergoing radical transformation under communist rule. She traveled to the Soviet Union, navigating the curated optimism presented to Western visitors. These trips generated both fascination and suspicion at home. Some accused her of naivete, of romanticizing regimes that suppressed dissent. Simone, for her part, sought to understand systems in motion rather than pronounce quick verdicts. She approached each context analytically, aware that ideological purity rarely survived contact with power. Her writings from these travels reveal neither blind endorsement nor simple condemnation, but engagement shaped by curiosity and conviction. The Cold War polarized discourse. To align with leftist causes was to risk association with authoritarianism. To reject them was to appear complacent toward injustice. Simone navigated this terrain with determination, sometimes misjudging, often provoking debate. She accepted that intellectual life required risk. Neutrality, in her view, was often a disguise for comfort. Fame intensified scrutiny. Journalists dissected her wardrobe, her manner, her private relationships, as if seeking contradiction. Invitations multiplied, so did attacks. Yet her daily discipline remained consistent. She wrote for hours each morning, drafted essays in the afternoon, met collaborators in the evening. The routine anchored her. Public turbulence did not alter the fundamental rhythm of her work. Throughout the decade, a central tension persisted: the demand for freedom and the cost of sustaining it. Simone had argued that women were shaped by social structures rather than destiny. Now she lived under the gaze of a society eager to confine her to caricature. She had insisted that individuals must choose and accept responsibility for those choices. Now she bore the consequences of her political positions in a divided nation. The coherence between her philosophy and her life was not seamless, but it was deliberate. By 1960, Simone de Beauvoir had entered her 50s with a reputation that was both solidified and unsettled. She was internationally known, translated, debated, admired, and resented. The controversy that had once isolated her now seemed almost routine. Yet the world around her was shifting with accelerating force. Colonial empires were collapsing. Old certainties about nation and authority were unraveling. Across Europe and beyond, younger generations questioned inherited structures with impatience. Simone observed these tremors not from the margins, but from within the field of impact. She had spent decades arguing that freedom must be chosen and defended. Now history was staging its own argument. The Algerian War, which had begun in 1954, entered its most brutal phase in the early 1960s. Reports of torture, repression, and systematic violence fractured French society. Simone did not retreat into abstraction. Through essays, petitions, and public statements, she denounced colonial brutality with unmistakable clarity. She condemned torture as a betrayal not only of Algerians, but of France's own professed values. The backlash was immediate. She received threats, insults, denunciations in print. To many she appeared disloyal, willing to criticize her nation at a moment of crisis. But for Simone, moral consistency required opposition wherever she saw oppression. National allegiance could not override ethical responsibility. The war's end in 1962 did not settle the question of power. It intensified scrutiny of institutions long treated as untouchable. In universities, classrooms, and factories, younger voices demanded structural change. Simone recognized in this unrest the logical extension of arguments she had articulated decades earlier. Authority unexamined becomes coercion. Freedom withheld breeds revolt. During these years, her own writing turned increasingly toward autobiography. Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter, published in 1958, had already traced her childhood and intellectual formation with striking candor. Through the 1960s, she continued the project in subsequent volumes, dissecting her past with analytic precision. These memoirs were not nostalgic reconstructions. They were examinations. She exposed her own ambitions, contradictions, and vulnerabilities without theatrical confession. If she demanded transparency from society, she would practice it herself. Writing about her life became a continuation of her philosophical method, experience subjected to scrutiny rather than mythologized. At the same time, something unexpected was happening to the second sex. For nearly 2 decades, it had circulated as provocation, admired by some, dismissed by others. Now, a younger generation of women began reading it, not as controversial literature, but as foundation. In the late 1960s, the women's liberation movement gathered force in Europe and the United States. Activists cited her central thesis that womanhood is constructed rather than predetermined as political principle. The phrase that had once scandalized critics now appeared on pamphlets and banners. Simone watched as ideas born in solitary research migrated into collective action. She was not instinctively a movement organizer. Her temperament remained analytical, skeptical of slogans. Yet she recognized the necessity of solidarity. When feminist groups in France began mobilizing around reproductive rights, workplace equality, and legal reform, she lent her name and presence with deliberation. The most visible moment came in 1971 with the Manifesto of the 343. In a country where abortion remained illegal, Simone joined hundreds of women in publicly declaring that they had undergone illegal abortions. The act was both confession and defiance. By signing, she risked legal consequences and renewed moral condemnation. But she understood the symbolic power of collective exposure. Silence protected unjust laws. Speech threatened them. The manifesto did not stand in isolation. Throughout the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, Simone appeared at demonstrations, wrote articles supporting women's rights, and engaged directly with activists who were often decades younger than she. The generational exchange was not without tension. Some younger feminists viewed her as emblematic of an earlier, more theoretical phase. Others revered her as precursor. Simone accepted neither pedestal nor dismissal. She insisted that movements require both analysis and action. The upheaval of May 1968 crystallized this transition. Students occupied universities. Workers went on strike. Barricades rose in Paris streets. The air thickened with slogans and possibility. Simone and Sartre visited occupied campuses, listened to debates, offered solidarity. They were not the faces of the rebellion, but their presence signaled continuity between post-war existentialism and contemporary revolt. The demand for autonomy in 1968 echoed the existential insistence that individuals must define themselves rather than submit to imposed structures. For Simone, these events confirmed that the private experiment in freedom she had undertaken in the 1930s had acquired public dimension. What began as philosophical stance now animated mass mobilization. Yet she remained cautious about romanticizing upheaval. Revolutions, she knew, could harden into new orthodoxies. Freedom required vigilance, not only passion. As the decade closed, Simone de Beauvoir occupied a paradoxical position. Once condemned as immoral and unfeminine, she was now claimed as intellectual foremother by a movement reshaping social discourse. Universities taught her work. Activists quoted her words. The world she had challenged in 1949 had begun to bend. Legal reforms concerning contraception and women's rights advanced across Europe. Conversations about gender, labor, and autonomy moved from margins toward mainstream. By 1970, second-wave feminism had undeniable momentum. Demonstrations filled streets. Consciousness-raising groups proliferated. Legislation faced pressure. Simone de Beauvoir was no longer merely an author whose ideas provoked debate. She had become symbol, invoked, debated, interpreted. History had begun to align with arguments she once articulated almost alone. By 1970, Simone de Beauvoir was in her 60s, and the world she had once challenged from the margins now invoked her name in public squares. The feminist movement she had helped ignite was no longer embryonic. It was organized, vocal, and increasingly influential. Young women carried banners demanding equality, reproductive rights, and economic autonomy. Her words circulated in pamphlets and speeches, sometimes simplified, sometimes sharpened. She was cited as origin and authority, honored at conferences, criticized in essays, debated in classrooms. The solitude of 1949 had given way to collective momentum. Yet Simone did not retreat into symbolic distance. Throughout the early 1970s, she remained physically present in demonstrations and political campaigns, particularly around abortion rights. The struggle in France intensified as activists pressed for legal reform against a deeply entrenched moral and legal system that criminalized women's control over their own bodies. Beauvoir signed petitions, gave interviews, stood alongside younger feminists in public rallies. She lent her reputation to causes that had once seemed unutterable in polite society. When the Veil Law was passed in 1975, legalizing abortion in France under certain conditions, it marked a profound shift in the landscape she had described decades earlier. The change did not belong to her alone, but she had helped prepare the ground. In these years, the dynamic of her activism shifted subtly. She was no longer the solitary thinker articulating unasked questions. She was part of a movement, one voice among many. This collective energy brought satisfaction but also distance. Movements simplify in order to mobilize. Simone's temperament remained analytic. She continued writing essays that explored nuance even as slogans filled the streets. Privately, another transformation was underway. Jean-Paul Sartre's health began to deteriorate sharply. Decades of relentless work, chain smoking, and minimal regard for physical limits took their toll. His eyesight, already compromised, worsened until near blindness. His energy diminished. The man who had once dominated debates with restless brilliance now struggled with fatigue and disorientation. Simone's role evolved from intellectual equal and companion to caretaker and guardian. Their pact, forged in youth as an experiment in radical freedom, confronted the unyielding fact of aging. They had never married, never merged households permanently, never allowed convention to dictate structure. Yet the depth of their attachment had never depended on ceremony. Now, as Sartre's body weakened, the abstract language of autonomy gave way to daily routines of assistance. Simone accompanied him to appointments, managed correspondence, shielded him from exploitation. She watched as public appearances became rarer, as the sharpness of his speech softened under strain. In April 1980, Jean-Paul Sartre died in Paris. The response was immediate and immense. Tens of thousands filled the streets for his funeral procession, transforming the city into a slow river of mourners. There was no official state ceremony, yet the scale of attendance signaled the end of an era. Sartre had embodied post-war intellectual engagement. His death marked the passing of a generation that had defined public philosophy as moral intervention. Simone walked behind the coffin, visible yet contained. The spectacle was public. Her grief was not. She had lost not simply a partner but the mind that had accompanied hers for over 50 years. Their conversations, debates, and shared references had shaped her interior life. Now that shared language fell silent. In the months following his death, she began writing Adieu, a farewell to Sartre. The book documented his final years with unsparing clarity. The decline, the hospital visits, the fragility of a once dominant intellect. Some readers would later accuse her of exposing too much, of violating privacy in the name of truth. Others recognized the gesture as consistent with her lifelong refusal to romanticize reality. She had always insisted that existence must be confronted without illusion. To sanitize Sartre's decline would have betrayed that ethic. By the close of 1980, Simone de Beauvoir stood alone in a world transformed by the very ideas she had helped articulate. The revolutionary fervor of earlier decades had given way to reflection. The streets no longer roared with the same urgency. The generation she and Sartre had led receded into memory. In 1980, Simone de Beauvoir found herself in a Paris that continued to hum with argument and ambition, yet felt irrevocably altered. For more than 50 years, Jean-Paul Sartre had been a daily presence. Sometimes near, sometimes at a distance, but always woven into the fabric of her thought. Now the conversations that had structured her mornings and animated her evenings were gone. The city moved forward with its habitual rhythm of cafes, publishers, demonstrations, elections. Students filled lecture halls. Journalists debated new crises. Simone, in her 70s, adjusted to a silence that was not theatrical but constant. The early 1980s brought increasing physical fragility. Years of relentless travel, writing, and public engagement had left their imprint. Illnesses lingered longer. Fatigue came more quickly. She continued to give interviews, though less frequently. When she appeared in public, she was greeted with a respect that bordered on reverence. Younger feminists approached her not as peer but as predecessor. Some embraced her arguments. Others critiqued them, extending debates about sexuality, labor, and difference in directions she had not anticipated. Her days grew quieter. The apartment that once hosted vigorous debate now held a more subdued routine. Letters still arrived. Manuscripts were reviewed. Visitors were received in measured intervals. She remained intellectually alert, though physically diminished. The world she had helped reshape continued its acceleration. New political crises, new cultural revolutions. Simone, once the insurgent voice, had become part of history. By the mid-1980s, her health declined more noticeably. In early 1986, she was hospitalized with pneumonia and related complications. The illness weakened her severely. There was no dramatic final declaration, no staged farewell. On April 14, 1986, Simone de Beauvoir died in Paris at the age of 78. News of her death circulated quickly through France and beyond. Tributes appeared in newspapers. Colleagues and critics alike acknowledged the scope of her influence. The reaction was solemn rather than explosive. A recognition that a figure who had shaped intellectual and political discourse for decades had passed. Her funeral took place at Montparnasse Cemetery, the same ground where Sartre had been buried 6 years earlier. She was laid to rest beside him. Simone de Beauvoir's life resisted simplification. She had been accused of immorality, celebrated as visionary, criticized as insufficiently radical, defended as foundational. She had navigated controversy without retreat, activism without surrender to dogma, intimacy without renouncing autonomy. Her insistence that womanhood is constructed rather than ordained reshaped the vocabulary of equality. Her commitment to freedom as lived responsibility extended beyond gender to politics, colonialism, and personal ethics. Paris moves on. Ideas evolve, but the questions she insisted on asking about freedom, responsibility, and the making of a self remain unsettled, alive and urgent.